RESTful service, and even how we can insert data, but we haven't looked at updating data, and that's what we're going to do in this module. This module is all about issuing and working with put actions or put requests that are going to flow up from the Angular application to the node6 Express RESTful service. Now, as we move through the course, we're going to start off by talking about how do we define a put request in our Express type of service. So we'll talk about that, and it's going to be very similar to what you've seen up to this point. In fact, the concepts are almost identical, so it's pretty quick and easy to work with. From there, we'll move back to the Angular service, and we'll add the ability to use the HTTP client to call up and make the put request to the RESTful service. We'll then go into our template-driven form and go into the component code and see how we can then call from the component into our data service. And then we'll explore our reactive form again and enhance it slightly to also handle the ability to update a customer and do the put request to the service, which then will get that data up to the RESTful service. So let's go ahead and get started by talking about adding a put request into our RESTful service using Express code. In order to handle update operations on the server side and get data updated in the database, we need to add a put action or operation into our RESTful service. And that's what we're going to take a look at in this section. So earlier we came into the controllers API customers, and in this customers controller JavaScript file we added an insert customer. Well, this actually is going to be very similar to what we're going to do to handle an update operation. In fact, there's only a few things we really need to change in here. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and just copy this, and then we'll tweak a few things and add a few things here or there, but it'll save us a little bit of typing. So first things first, we probably want to call this update customer, and we'll change our log statement to update customer. Now, I'm going to show you that we can also log additional info. We didn't do this for the insert, but I'm going to do a little bonus feature here. And we're going to say that let's write out the request body. And so we can come into here and just say req.body. And what that'll do is allow us in the console to actually see the data that's going to be updated. Now we could do that with the insert operation as well, but sometimes that's helpful when you're in debug mode and just want to see the raw data that the server's actually getting. Now, of course, you could also set breakpoints in the code and handle it that way too. Now, we still need to work with a state. Each customer has a state associated, so we're going to pull that state ID out of the body. We're going to get the data back for the state, so if we don't have an error, we'll go ahead and leave that. Then we want to hit this code. Now, if we go into the customer's repository, you'll see that we do have an update customer, and it takes the ID of the customer, the actual body, you can see the state, and then our callback to get the data back, and then it ultimately is going to save that customer into MongoDB. All right, so all we need to really do is call our update customer. So let's go ahead and add that, and then you saw it first off takes the ID. So we're going to grab that from the URL. So params is going to allow us to, as we showed earlier, grab the route parameter called ID, and then we'll pass that along. We still need the request body, we still need the state, and we still need our callback function. Now in here, if there is an error, we probably want to change this to update customer and write out the error, and then we would of course say update failed, and pretty much everything stays the same there. Otherwise, we'll come on down in here, we'll say update customer okay, and then we're going to do the same thing. We're going to return the customer. So there is enough here that we can't necessarily just reuse exactly the previous code, but with a few tweaks, it's very similar. And that's pretty much it. Now that will automatically allow us to have an endpoint, but we don't have a way to call this particular endpoint right now. So as we've seen before, we need to come on in and work with the actual route. So we need to add a put operation. So post was for insert. Now we're going to do a put. So we'll go ahead and do a router.put. And as you saw, the put has a route parameter for ID. So we'll go ahead and put that in. And then we're going to bind the current context of this to the update customer. So we have that. We'll bind it to this. And it looks like I missed an R on router, so we better add that. So let's open up Postman. And I've already loaded up a post that we saw earlier. So this post already had a body. But in this case, we're going to be updating an existing record. So we do need the body, but we also need an ID so we can work with this. So what I'm going to do is, first off, let's do a get, and let's go find an ID that we actually want to update. I'm just going to kind of grab most of what you're going to see here. So we'll grab kind of from here on up. And let's go now back into our area up here. We'll do a put. And then we're going to have to pass an ID, which I'll do in a moment. But let me come to body. We're going to do a raw. I'm just going to paste this in and then end our object literal, or really in this case our JSON data. We'll go ahead and leave all these. We don't need the state. That's going to be found dynamically because the client won't actually have the full state, at least in the way this is being passed. The ID that you're going to see here, we can leave that, but we're going to actually grab that ID from the route parameter you saw. And so now let's change Marcus to Marcus or something like that. And so we'll post up this customer and see how our endpoint actually handles it. So let's hit send here. And it looks like it works. So we got back the customer. We have Marcus. And same ID, of course. All right, so that looks good. Status is true, no error. Now, to really prove it worked, we probably should go back to all the customers here, and we'll do a send. And it looks like Marcus shows up, so perfect. So, of course, we could go back to the put if we want to fix this, go back to the body, change it back, and now we can do a put operation again up to the server, and what we get back should just be Marcus. So it looks like our RESTful service is now capable of handling a put request. So now we can move forward to the client side and start calling this. Our RESTful service now has a way to handle put requests that come up to the service. So now we're going to switch our focus to the client side and add the capability to make a put request from an Angular service. So in a previous section of the course, we talked about how we can do an insert operation with a post. And you can see that doing something like a put operation, which is really an update in this case, is pretty much the same type of thing. Now, of course, we're not going to use post, we're going to use put, but everything else is very, very similar. Let's go ahead and add this. So I'm going to make a new update customer, and this is going to take a customer object of type iCustomer. And then it's going to return an observable as usual. So we'll go ahead and do an observable of, and then we can return whatever we'd like here. Now we'll return an observable of iCustomer. All right, now in here, all we have to do is simply do our HTTP put. So we can do our return HTTP, and this will look really similar, but what we're going to do is we need to pass the URL. So we're going to add a little slash here, and we're going to add customer._ID, which is the Mongo ID. Now the second parameter is going to be our data, and that's going to be the customer. That's very similar to what you'll see up here in the insert, so really no change there. And then we could add other things, options, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Now, for now, though, we're going to come on in, and we're going to add our map, and we'll add our response again, and then we're going to add a little bit of custom code in here. We'll come back to that, and then we'll add our catch. We'll call our handle error. Let's first off grab our data. So we'll say const data, and we're going to parse our JSON again, just like up above. And I'm going to do a log here just so we have something to refer to when we do run it later, if we want to. So we'll say update customer status, and we can write out the data.status. Now, if you remember, we get back a status, an error, and we get back the customer data. All right, and then we're going to return data.customer. Okay, so that's why we have an observable of customer, just like we had up here. So you can see that this is a very, very similar piece of code to what we had up above, and we could probably even work with automating this a little bit more, but we'll break it down piece by piece here again. So we return the observable, but this time we do a put. Now a put, of course, only works when we're doing a HTTP type call. Of course, you can't do put with regular forms in the standard web world, but in this world you can. So if you haven't used put before, this is our way of saying, hey, I'm not doing an insert post. I'm going to do a put operation. So we go ahead and add that customer on up there. Then we do the same thing. from here, you've already seen this. We parse the JSON, do some logging, and then return that actual customer here. And we catch the error. So that's really all we have to do. So now we can move to the component level, and we can consume this update customer function. Earlier, we enhanced our Angular service to support a put or an update. So now what we're going to do is consume that update customer function that we added in one of our components so that we can actually handle the update as the user edits a form. So before we jump into the component, I want to emphasize one thing, and this has been mentioned a few times, but it's important to address. We're doing some really basic logging in our data service here. And this is an opportunity where we might even have another HTTP call where we log some of these messages back to the server. So we'd have to set up a separate RESTful service for that, but we could certainly do it. And the reason I'm mentioning this is, in my opinion, the service is really the place that should be logging, whether it's local or calling back to the server with the data, the information about what happened, in this case with the put request. I want the component to either get a customer or not get a customer. It's really up to them to deal with that. But at the service level, we want to be very specific about what happens when things break and what happens when things work. Now, in this case, I've made the decision to just go ahead and return the customer. But you may say, no, I don't want to do that. I want to return the raw data, for instance. And that would certainly be a valid option. Now the component would have to know to go to the customer property, but they would have access to get to the status in the error message. Now, that's something you would have to debate and determine, in your own world and own applications, how you want to handle. But I'm going to go ahead in this example and just keep it as is, and we're going to return this iCustomer back. So now what we're going to do is, back in our customer edit that we've seen, we already have the functionality to do an insert customer. And so we're going to do the same type of thing. When they submit the form, the submit function gets called here. If they have an ID on the customer, then that means we already have an existing customer, and therefore we probably don't want to do an insert. We want to do an update. And so now we can call into the code and actually do this. So we're going to use our data service that's already been injected. We'll call our update customer, and we're going to pass the customer that we have up towards the top here of our component. So this will actually be not this instance of the customer, but if we had a customer earlier when we get it, that's what would be displayed in the form, and that's what the customer would represent, of course. Now we're going to do a very similar operation to what you see down here, actually. In fact, I could probably cut and paste most of that, but we'll go ahead and type this one out. So I'm going to subscribe, and this is going to give me back, as we just showed in the service, an iCustomer. So we'll go ahead and add our arrow function here for our callback for the subscription. And then we can also have, I showed this a little bit earlier, we'll take that out, and we can have kind of an error function at the bottom of this where we could do some additional logging that might be just specific to the component itself, though. So we'll just do a console.log error. Now, obviously the error logging here is pretty basic, but this is where you could take it to a whole nother level. And you could, from here, call back to the data service, which then logs an error. But I think the data service, because it already knows if there's an error or not, should be responsible for that. But, that is very subjective. So in here, we'll say, if we did get a customer back, then that's a good thing. Because if you recall, the RESTful service, if there's an error, does not return a customer. So we'll go ahead and do the same router navigate. And we're going to navigate basically to the root type of route, the customers. All right, that'll take care of if it works. Now, if it doesn't work, we'll put our else, and we have this error message property. Let me just scroll up to that as a reminder. We have this error message property. That's actually bound into the UI with a component. So we're going to go ahead and update that error message with our error message. We'll just say unable to save customer. Okay, so now we have all the code we need to consume the update customer function that data service provides. We subscribe to that observable we get back. If we get a customer back, that means things are good. We're going to go ahead and navigate back to the grid, the home page, if you will. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and log some type of an error. In this case, it'll actually display it, though, to the UI. And now we're ready to rock and roll here. So let's go to the form itself. And let me refresh to make sure we pick up all the changes. Let's go back to our Marcus Hightower here. All right, and let's just do Marcus 2 and maybe Hightower 2. Come on down, it's an update. Go ahead and save it, and it looks like it worked, but I always like to double check. Let's refresh. Yep, looks like it took, and we'll go ahead and fix it back. All right, so our update is working. Beautiful. Now, all that's happening for the update button, earlier we saw an insert button, but I have up here in the component a operation text. Now, it defaults to insert, but when we get the customer, if we have an actual customer with an ID on it, in other words, the route up at the top has that ID, which I'll show that in a moment, then we're going to change that operation text to update. And that's all I'm doing to dynamically change the text of the button. So if we come down to the button itself, you'll see down here we have our submit button, and it simply binds to the operation text. That way I don't have to have two buttons for an insert or for an update. Now, the other thing we're doing is as we run this, of course, we have our routing. So you'll notice as I click it, there's our route parameter ID. And of course, that's how I'm determining to change the value. So if we go back into here, I grab a snapshot of the params. We talked about this earlier. If it's not a 0 or basically some other item, if I do an insert, I always pass a 0 up there. That's why I'm checking for 0. But if it's not, then we're going to go ahead and change it to update and then get the customer. So that's why the button is changing very easily between update and insert and things like that. So there we have it. We now have a submit function that's all filled out now. If we have an ID, we can do our put to the server, our update. Else, if we don't, it's an insert. Now, we still have some new functionality we're going to add into this later, but we're starting to make some good progress now. The final piece of code we're going to explore is enhancing the reactive form to also support the update capability that we now have available on our RESTful service. So let's jump on into that and explore what we can add there as far as code goes. So as with a template-driven form, you'll see that we have a submit, and we talked earlier about how in the reactive world, you can get access to the actual value, which is the different form control values, and whether the form's valid or not. And we'd already added the ability to do an insert. Now you'll see the setup in this type of form is identical to the template-driven that we did earlier. With the submit, I check if there's an ID. If there is, we're going to do our put request to the service. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and do our post, our insert. Now to make this part work, we can come on in, and I already have some code here because it's very similar to what you saw earlier. So we're going to do the same thing. We're going to call into the data services update customer and pass in the value. Now in this case, again, the value is of type iCustomer, so we're really passing the customer. It's just slightly different in how we do it with the reactive world. And then we're going to get back some data. Now, previously, I was returning the status. Now, if you remember, we have the ability to get back the status, the error, and the customer. But I mentioned earlier in a previous section in this module that I like to have the component kind of be in the dark, as neutral as possible about errors and things. And so instead, what we can do is we can return the customer again, and you'll see this is pretty much identical to what we did down here with the insert. And that way the component's only worried about if it gets a customer or not. The service itself will take care of logging and things like that if there's any errors as it communicates with our RESTful service on the server side. All right, so now that we've seen that and added that code, let's go on back to our form. And I'm going to reload it back from the home page here. And right now, this is the template driven. So let's go back. And what I'm going to do is come into the routing. We'll come on down here to our app routing. And right now, you can see our customer edit component. Let's go ahead and change this. And we'll comment in the customer edit reactive. Save this and reload. And we should see the same type of functionality. So now we'll click here. Now it's the reactive form. We'll do update, and let's refresh just to make sure it took. Looks like it did. So you can see that whether or not you choose the template-driven approach or the reactive, the code itself for interacting with the post or the put or whatever it may be type of request to the service doesn't really change much. What changes is obviously in how you write the form and how you work with that form, but it's kind of good to know both approaches. And that way, as you work with these, you can see that the code itself is very similar actually. So that's a quick exploration of the reactive form for editing our customers. In this module, you've seen how we can work with data updates. We started by talking about creating a put action with our node6 Express RESTful service so that we can update our data in the database. From there, we learned how we can use the HTTP client in an Angular service to call http.put, get that customer up to the service, and then perform that update operation. And then we saw how that service is then reusable again across our template-driven form and our reactive-driven form. And really the code there was very, very similar between those two different form styles. So up to this point in the course, you've now seen how we can create get type of actions and put and post, but we haven't talked about deleting data. And that's what we're going to work with next.
निश्चय में लोग मार रहा शायद देना इसलिए बोलते हैं जैसे का पता जितना घाटा है उतना बात की इकोनॉमी देश में 9 लाख लोग होने के बाद क्यों खोल रहा है वैसे थोड़ी तो यही देखना है वैसे भी लोग मर जाएंगे ऐसे बस न्यूज़ वाले कवर नहीं कर इसका मतलब थोड़ी है कल बरखा जब कवर के लिए कोटा से इंदौर रास्ते में पैर फट के मर गया था ऐसा बंदा न्यूज़ वाले कवर नहीं कर पैर चलते थे पैर फट गया था मर गया रास्ते में देखते तो वो कल मैं देखा पंजाब में जलंधर में था वो बोल रहा है कि मतलब उनको पैसा नहीं दे रहा है हमारा रेंट नहीं हमको जाना ही पड़ेगा हम कैसे निकल दिया रास्ता बिहार के लिए तो न्यूज़ वाला कवर करने में तो नहीं कर रहे फिर देखो सब सही चल रहा है उनको टीआरपी मिल जाएगा पिटा गया ये हो गया ऑप्शन दीजिए मैं तो नहीं खोला तो ऑप्शन क्या है तो वीडियो बंद शुरू करेगा अभी तो ऐसे भी लोग मर रहे हैं ऐसे ही मर रहा है बस लगना है किससे मर रहा है तो सैल्यूट करना चाहिए यहाँ पे मजदूरों को इतना कुछ होने के बाद भी रोड पे निकल नहीं रहे कि हंगामा नहीं किए एसेंस कौन करो किसने कर रहा है हम अगर रहते बाई चांस चीज़ हम तुम्हारा डेली जो मिल रहा है तो रुकते किसकी बात नहीं रुकते
नहीं इलेक्ट्रिसिटी एक है ना बोला कि हर 15 दिन में आटा चावल भोला के भोला वो कॉलोनी के हिसाब से रख देते हैं
हाँ जो कर रहा है ऐसा नहीं कर रहा खर्च तो नहीं पॉसिबल ना तो बोल रहे हैं 70-60% एरिया
बोला है और घर पे कॉल करके बोला कि और हम तो फाइबर करने के लिए खाते हैं और 15 दिन मिली है तब बोला कि वो
ये सब एरिया में है जानते हो जैसे गुजरात हुआ दिल्ली हुआ तो वहाँ उनकी आबादी से अधिक उनके यहाँ मजदूर है ठीक है ऊपर से सबसे बड़ी बात है कि कितने लोग खिलाए ऐसा तो नहीं डेवलप्ड स्टेट है दिल्ली में 10 लाख लोगों को खाना खिलाया जा रहा है फिर भी 1 लाख 1.5 लाख बचे हुए हैं तो कितना खिलाएंगे हर स्टेट की जिम्मेदारी नहीं पड़ेगी अब छोड़ दिया अपने बंदे जमा जाए उनके रहने को कोई होता है वोट देने के टाइम तो टांग टांग के घर देखिए बुलाते हो छोटा भाई वोट देना है
मेरे गाँव में एक क्या बोलता है दादाजी है वो खड़े हुए थे वो 4 भाई जितना 4 भाई में जितना भाई नेक्स्ट जनरेशन हाँ वही ग्रुप में FTR कॉल्स आता है FTR कॉल्स वहाँ पर सेलेक्ट कर दो उसके बाद एजेंट में तुम्हारा नाम सर्च करा रहा है
My cupboard is free of insects.
Whatever.
My cupboard is free of insects. Cockroach.
Oh,
Did you see some nice spells coming up?
I think you fire spray.
No. Casper. What do you say in Hindi? Lighting for God.
Oh, in plate.
This is
Kapoor Hindi.
Kapoor. In Tamil, Karpuram.
Karpooram.
बंगोल लगा पिलाएगा बैंक को बहुत कुछ
This is,
बनाया।
if you keep in the cupboard means, no cockroach will be coming here.
और सुंदरा ही कहाँ पे है? और सुंदरा लोग के किधर है?
रामचंद्र कार्तिक को मालूम है। Where is Vamsundra?
Where is Sundra?
Vamsundra?
Yeah.
Back side.
Back side?
2 kilometers.
The bank. 19 केस है वहाँ पे।
What happened?
10 cases, sorry. 10 cases in Sundra colony. अगर एक बार बोले ना मजदूर हो सकता है, वही बेचारा वही फैल रहा है ना, वो एक घर में 10-10 लोग रह रहे हैं, एक को फैल रहा है, 10 हो जा रहा है, इस चीज़ को कोई ऑब्जर्व नहीं कर रहा, लोग कह रहे हैं जहाँ है वहाँ रहे हो, ये देखो कितना हायर कितना वो खतरा है कि बैंडो फैल रहा है, तो एक साथ 20 लोगों को लेके जा रहा है। अब जो महाराष्ट्र मंत्री क्या कह रहा था कि पूरा मुंबई साफ करवा देंगे सभी सब, ये झोपड़ी में रहते हैं, एक एरिया में 100-200 लोग रहते हैं, एक को फैलेगा 2000 लोग मिल जाएंगे।
बन गया।
ये सब में वो देने वाले के लिए ज़्यादा
Wait.